Hello, and welcome to this lecture on the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is a primarily French movement of intellectualism. Um, I'll talk about a few of the causes and motivations in a second, but just know that this was not an instantaneous, sudden change in Europe. This happened over decades, and it happened over a long period of time, and the effects will be felt for a while as well. It did not happen all of a sudden, but it did happen over a series of decades and leads to some monumentous events, uh, including but not limited to the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, the Latin American revolutions, Napoleon. You could argue its influence is wide-ranging. So let's look and see what the Enlightenment was. When we talk about the causes of the Enlightenment, there's several factors that went into causing the Enlightenment. The biggest, most important intellectual movement that caused the Enlightenment was the scientific revolution. The scientific revolution, as we discussed previously, looked at applying natural rules and laws and ideas to all of society, in the world of science and math, I should say at least. So you take these laws of mathematics and science, you discover them in the scientific revolution, you come up with methods to discover more laws and more ideas. And then these philosophers were the intellectuals who believed in applying these scientific laws to politics, government, society. They would then write down these laws and take these same types of thinking and ideas from the scientific revolution and apply them to society. So to clarify what I'm saying, the laws and methods which people use to discover the laws in the world around them, in the worlds of astronomy and medicine and physics and things like that, those methods were discovered during the scientific revolution and then used to discover more laws about religion, politics, government, with the Enlightenment. There was a general attitude about skepticism with literature, with religion as well. So we see this skeptical nature kind of added to and looked at in regards to religion, and that aided the Enlightenment along. We also see a continuing growth in literacy and reading and writing across Europe. People are able to read and write more across Europe, and therefore they're going to be more open and open to these new Enlightenment ideas as well. It wasn't just the ideas of the scientific revolution and the methodology of the scientific revolution that inspired the Enlightenment, but individual people. John Locke and his ideas that he came up with around the Glorious Revolution in England, that inspired people in mainland Europe to discover the absolute truths in regards to, again, politics, government, religion, and society. But also Isaac Newton, again, his Newtonian world machine ideology that said the same set of mathematical principles that affect the sky, the planets, the stars, the ocean, the tides, all that. If there's a universal set of mathematical principles that apply to the entire universe, then there should be a similar set of principles that apply to all of society, whether it's religion, government, living as a peasant in a farm somewhere. Everyone should be able to abide by some universal truths that are out there. You see lots of locations for the philosophers to kind of do their ideas. One of the main locations is through the French Salon. Salons where, fancy gatherings and meetings where, thinkers, aristocrats, artists, government employees, government workers, the bourgeoisie, the growing bourgeoisie, they're not quite an official thing yet, but they're getting there. They would meet and gather and discuss these ideas of the Enlightenment with each other. There would be invite-only parties where people could discuss and debate ideas of the Enlightenment. They were hosted by wealthy women, giving them a role in the French Enlightenment. And they became big things. Artists could unveil their works at these salons, and people could gain notoriety by participating in a salon. To be invited to one was a big honor. So, you can make a name for yourself by getting an invite to these things and by dazzling the other attendees with your performance and your debate skills. However, if you weren't a rich person in the upper crust of French society, you could also participate in other forms of the public sphere. The public sphere, as I talked about last unit, is just this growing environment in Europe of intellectual and academic curiosity. So, in the scientific revolution, scientists would talk to each other across Europe, debate each other, write in academic journals and things like that about what's going on, and to challenge each other's ideas or support each other's ideas in regards to science and scientific discoveries. This public sphere continued and grew during the Enlightenment. As Europe is getting more globally connected, you're seeing the growth of coffee houses, cafes, taverns, which are bars, and these are growing and growing and growing as Europe's getting more urbanized and more connected to other parts of the world and getting introduced to new things like coffee, and coffee is getting spread around Europe. So these places are getting more and more spread throughout Europe, leading to more and more people to go to these places and then debate each other. And one of the main topics of debate in the 1700s, especially the late 1700s, was ideas related to the Enlightenment. What rights do people deserve, and things like that. Additionally, you're going to see across Europe these ideas around civilization versus non-civilization. So in Europe, they viewed themselves in a very civilized way. However, they viewed people outside of Europe in a very non-civilized way. They viewed people outside of Europe as, particularly people living in the New World, in Africa or in Asia, as savages and not civilized. Which some Enlightenment thinkers, thought fondly of. They thought that, it'd be really great to be living in a state of nature. So, that's going to inspire some people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau with some writings. Finally, we do see censorship become a major issue for some writers. They aren't going to be able to, directly criticize and challenge the governments across Europe, because what type of government would want to be criticized like that? And censorship was very easy to do. If you're working in this period, if you're a governor or a king in this period, it's very easy to destroy printing presses and imprison people who are doing things like that. There's no First Amendment protections in Europe at this time. So we do see the Enlightenment philosophers and writers become creative with their ways to get around censorship, using pseudonyms or criticizing Europe from an outsider perspective, which I'll kind of give an example of that in a second. But it did kind of force these Enlightenment philosophers to, get creative with what they wrote about. All right, so let's go through the list of some of the main philosophers and what they wrote about. Again, these philosophers, these writers, are important and impactful, and they made a big impact on European intellectual history and political history. However, there's tons of Enlightenment writers that occurred, and there's artists and cartoonists and people that wrote pamphlets and newsletters and things like that across Europe that will not be named, but they did the work of kind of translating and transcribing the works of these people into forms that the rest of Europe could kind of absorb and understand. So they did this for less pay and less notoriety, but they were just equally as important as some of these big names we're going to look at. First name is Baron de Montesquieu. He was a member of the French nobility. You could argue he was a noble of the robe. He was a parlement, which is a appellate judge kind of. He would kind of uphold court rulings and legal filings in the area of Bordeaux, France. But he wrote he wrote his major work, The Spirit of Laws, which I'm sure you know about. It's a big influence on our country's history. He wrote about how it's really important to have separation and limited powers in government. He really liked England's government post-Glorious Revolution, which was a constitutional monarchy which had limited power. You didn't have an absolute monarch with tyrannical powers, kind of calling all the shots. You had a king who was limited by a constitution, by parliament. So that's really his big idea there. Again, separation of powers, checks and balances. He also wrote about France and criticized France as far as their church goes, as far as their government goes. He was pro-religious toleration. He was anti-slavery. But his other big work was called the Persian Letters. And he was able to criticize France kind of in a somewhat direct way by using outsiders as, kind of tools and pawns in his writing. So he wrote this book, Persian Letters, from the perspective of two Persians. Persian is, in this period, Persia would be, equal to like where Iran is today. But it's two Persians traveling in Europe and noting kind of the backwards and anti-liberal institutions that were in France at the time, such as the dominance of the Catholic Church and the absolute power of the monarchy. these Persians would write and kind of criticize these institutions. But even though Montesquieu was writing it, and he wrote about it as kind of like a satire from the perspective of Persians, he was kind of able to get around censors and kind of avoid censorship and harsh criticism in that manner. So again, Montesquieu, big idea, separation of powers, checks and balances in government, not necessarily a pro-democracy work, or a pro-republican form of government, but he did want there to be some sort of check on some monarchy, as did most of the philosophers. They were not anti-monarch, but just wanted good monarchs in power. They couldn't envision a democratic form of government. Voltaire is another big name. Voltaire received a humanist education, a Jesuit education at that, so he was well known to the ways of religion and well informed of those ideas. He wrote plays, wrote satires, wrote books, wrote tons of work, and his big opponent was organized religion. Voltaire was a deist himself. He believed, as many Enlightenment thinkers were in deism, that God created the universe, a Christian God probably created the universe and set things in order, but they didn't necessarily interact with the world after that. They've kind of just sit back and watch the universe play out, like a clockmaker would make a clock and get it working and then just step back and let the clock run. Deists believed in that's how the universe was run, so there was no point in all these other religious practices and institutions in his eyes. But his famous phrase, again, goes to, crushing organized religion, which in this case is the infamous thing that, organized religion and state-mandated religion is even worse. One of the best cases that kind of shows his distaste for religion was the case of Jean Calas. Jean Calas was a French Huguenot, French Protestant, who had a son. Son was apparently sick and tired of being a Huguenot and perhaps being persecuted in France. France was heavily Catholic, not very fond of the Huguenots. So Jean Calas and his son were having a bit of a disagreement, and his son was maybe threatening his father with a Catholic conversion and changing his faith to Catholicism. One day, his son was discovered dead, and Jean Calas, the father, is accused of murder. Rumors spread around town that Jean Calas murdered his son, killed his son for maybe his apparent or future conversion to Catholicism. So Jean Calas is a victim of these rumors. He's arrested by authorities, tortured by authorities for his apparent murder of his own son, and he is killed by the French government after, through the process of torture. Voltaire learns about this, writes about it, and says, there's just really not enough evidence and enough logic behind, blaming Jean Calas. There's not a lot of evidence to accuse him and blame him for these issues. So this is spread throughout France. People kind of start to read and get more interested in the trial. And Voltaire is, he is successful more or less in exonerating Jean Calas. Even though Jean Calas was killed by the government, his family, he gets a retrial, and the court finds Jean Calas innocent of the murder of his son. Again, even though they're both dead. It was discovered that his son actually committed suicide. The father did not kill the son. And therefore, we see the family of Jean Calas receive a payment from the French government. Voltaire was also a big victim of censorship, had to travel around France and stay with numerous supporters and patrons to support his work and his ideas and things like that. So we're going to see Voltaire, get lots of support from these rich people that, kind of protected him from, a vengeful government. Another big name is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, maybe one of the most influential people from the Enlightenment in terms of inspiring the French Enlightenment. However, Jean-Jacques Rousseau did a lot more than just talk about some of those ideas. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote about the social contract, as did Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and others. But basically, Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote that in times before history, man existed in a state of nature. And again, we've kind of talked about this. He was maybe inspired by Europeans traveling abroad and seeing indigenous people in Africa, Americas, etc., and how happy they could be. But Jean-Jacques Rousseau said that before government, before society, before civilization, man was happy in a state of nature, living and interacting with each other in a happy communal way. Then private property comes around. Private property forces a need for contract law and contract agreements. And to enforce those laws and agreements, you need government systems, which leads to this massive civilization that has transpired. Jean-Jacques Rousseau then said, because society has appeared and civilization has appeared and government is now necessary because there's so much private property and things like that, that government must exist now. We cannot turn back the hands of time, but government is a necessary evil. It's still, just because it's necessary doesn't mean it's a good thing. We need to keep it around to keep society running. Therefore, Jean-Jacques Rousseau said, the social contract is necessary. We need an agreement between the people and government so that the government will not infringe on as many rights as they can in order to kind of get man as close to a state of nature as possible, which is pretty much impossible, but to keep man as close to that original state of nature as possible. And the best way to do that is for the governments to follow the general will. The general will is Rousseau's main idea. It's what he's most closely attached to in AP Euro, but it's the idea that what is best for most people, what most people want, is what government should do. So the general will is kind of where the public opinion goes in the most. Therefore, government should follow the general will and follow what most people want the most. You should do what people want for the most part. That's the best way for people to achieve the most liberty and get the closest to the state of nature and give people what they want. So he, again, super influential to movements, not just the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, but even the Romantic era. We'll talk about Romanticism in a later lecture. Romanticism was a movement that was anti-Enlightenment, more focused on emotions, feeling, history, and nature. We'll talk more about that later. He had thoughts on childcare. He said that children should be educated in the heart and mind. You shouldn't just give them a life full of experiences or a life full of school, but both. It's really important for kids to get access to both. However, his views towards women were more backwards. He believed that women, their main job was to take care of kids and be an obedient wife. He did not, he was pretty awful to the women and children in his own life, having affairs and sending children to orphanages or foundling homes, as they were called back then, which were more deadly orphanages. So Rousseau, complex guy, but really impactful character of the Enlightenment. Getting into some smaller names, we have Denis Diderot. His big work was the Encyclopedia, which collected lots of works, a lot of the works of the other Enlightenment thinkers. He collected them in a text called the Encyclopedia, which talked about ideas around toleration, superstition, improving society, improving government, and things like that. It's his biggest contribution. David Hume, we've talked about him, empiricism, using evidence to make claims and justify arguments. Cesare Beccaria is new. He was an Italian guy, wrote about crime and punishment, big writer on habeas corpus, making sure that you have evidence before you imprison someone is a vitally important thing. He wrote about the use of torture. He said, is it not barbaric for, the noble European state to use torture and murder on people that commit crimes, even property crimes? How is that fair? Is that not hypocritical? Is that eye for an eye? Isn't that kind of outdated? Isn't that kind of barbaric? So he called into question some of those legal practices and punishments. And then the Marquis de Concordet, active until the French Revolution, when he was, for some reason, again, he's a member of the Enlightenment, but he decided to pick the side of King Louis XVI, because again, this is not out of the question. Many Enlightenment thinkers were pro-monarchy. They maybe weren't pro-King Louis XVI, but they did not believe in, violent revolution all the time, especially if you're a member of the upper classes. But he fought for King Louis and was enslaved as a rower on a slave ship instead of death because of his pro-equality stances. He was pro-women, and he believed in equality for all races, which is a outlier. Most of these Enlightenment thinkers did not think in equal rights, believe in equal rights for women or equal rights for all races. When some of them say they were against slavery, as Jean-Jacques Rousseau did, they were really just, against this supposed slavery of the French people by the French king. They believed the third estate was enslaved by the monarchy. They weren't talking about chattel slavery, because when Haiti has their slave revolt, lots of them are pretty quiet. They're not going to really have a lot to say. That's not always true, but some of them were just not really supportive of that revolt, or they didn't even live to see it in many cases, I should say, too. Anyway, we do see the Marquis de Concordat. He was supportive of public education, of a constitutional government, and free markets and things like that. We'll talk about economics in a second. That's a really important aspect, is this idea of capitalism and free markets. It meshes with the idea of liberalism, which is going to be a big idea of the Enlightenment. Speaking of, let's talk about economic liberalism. So everything I've mentioned up to this point would involve political liberalism. Political liberalism, again, is that people have equality, liberty, and freedom of speech and things like that. The freedom to criticize your government, freedom to participate in government in a basic sense. That's the idea behind political liberalism, which still exists in our country today. Whether you're, a Republican, a Democrat, or someone else, you're going to believe in some form of liberalism, that people should have a say in government, have freedom of speech, and things like that. I know it's hard to believe that today in today's political climate, but that is relatively true. Politicians generally believe in liberalism in a large sense. So that's political liberalism. To go alongside these ideas of liberalism that we've seen develop in the Enlightenment, we also have the idea of economic liberalism. We're going to have two main forces, the physiocrats and then Adam Smith. They're going to develop this idea of economic liberalism that's really going to spread across Europe and become super impactful, and arguably still pretty impactful with us today. The first people to really kind of discover that there's not just political liberalism but economic liberalism were the French physiocrats. People like Francois Cuisnet, probably saying that name incorrectly, but it's okay. These physiocrats really wrote a lot about agriculture and land. Again, the predominant, economic theory of the day was mercantilism, saying that, colonies generate wealth, gold, etc., that, makes a nation more powerful. And that's kind of the main goal of states, is to collect gold and silver, and your country's economic strength is based on the amount of gold and silver you can collect. You shouldn't trade with others. You should, keep your resources to yourself and only maybe sell resources to make a profit to other countries. That's the most you should do. The physiocrats, though, they start to change this economic theory. They say, actually, instead of gold and silver, true wealth comes from land. You need land to generate wealth. You could only get wealthier if you get more land, and then if you build up on that land by doing agriculture or something else that's very, very productive. So if you use your land for a very productive reason, that's how you generate more wealth. If you just don't let it sit and, not do anything, that's bad. But if you use your land in a productive way and grow food on it, that's really good. That's how you can generate wealth and have a steady stream of income. They also believed in that people should be able to pursue their own economic interest on that land. And if that means, building institutions and other, more productive forms of economic activity on that land, that's good. They were also incredibly anti-government intervention. The governments of Europe in the mercantilist era were heavily pro-intervention. They would block sales and businesses from trading across borders. They would prevent other countries from coming in and interfering in their country's economy by buying or selling things. So you're going to see tons of government intervention in the mercantilist era. The physiocrats were heavily against that. They said that people should be able to do what they want in this liberal sense. You should be able to buy and sell what you want. You should be able to do what economic activity you want. And the government should not, force people to do or not do things in terms of economic forces. So the physiocrats, again, kind of set the stage for this economic liberalism. And then we have Adam Smith kind of take it home. A Scottish philosopher, writer on economics, one of the most influential economic theorists of all time. We are still living in his legacy today, in capitalist America. But Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776, and it is a criticism of mercantilism. It's a more of a full-throated criticism of mercantilism than what the physiocrats did. He said it's not, the economy should not be a zero-sum game. In mercantilism, there's winners and losers. If you sell your goods, you're a winner. If you buy those goods from other countries, you're a loser because you're giving them gold. Why would you do that? Adam Smith said, no, no, no. If one country needs resources or goods or products, they should be able to buy them from other countries. It's not, a winners and losers game, that both can be winners. If America produces agricultural products really well and England produces, shipbuilding products really well, and they have a really efficient economy in both senses, why can't they just do business with each other and trade? It shouldn't be you do this, you have to do everything at once. It should be I do this best, you do this best, let's work with each other. So this idea of free trade was kind of developed by Adam Smith. He said that, again, like the physiocrats, that people should not be told what to do. They should not be forced to do one job or one activity. That you should let people do whatever they wanted to when it comes to economics. He said, unlike the physiocrats, that land was the most important thing. Adam Smith said labor is the most important thing. Farmers, merchants, artisans. This is what really constitutes the wealth of nations. People choosing what they want to do, what work they want to do, and doing it the best they can. Because if you have people more active and more engaged in what they're doing economically, you'll have a more active economy, a more productive economy, and therefore you'll have a wealthier nation. Again, the wealth of nations, according to Smith, is not built upon gold, as the mercantilists believe, or on land, as the physiocrats believe, but on labor. That labor constitutes the true wealth of nations. Contrary to popular belief, Adam Smith was not entirely anti-government interference. He was not entirely laissez-faire. He believed in governments providing basic structures like armies, police or protective forces and things like that, infrastructure in order for economic activity to occur. So what we're going to see, though, is this idea of political liberalism, which, I've explained what that means on these slides from Montesquieu, Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot, and others. That's political liberalism. This economic liberalism is going to tie in with political liberalism and just be simply known as liberalism. So as we see countries adopt liberal ideas, they're not adopting just politically liberal ideas, they're adopting, economically liberal ideas as well. They kind of go hand in hand. Freedom of speech, freedom of, job activity, right? They kind of both agree with one another to a sense. But we'll expand upon this as we kind of go through the next couple of units and the Industrial Revolution begins. Women. We're going to see women, their roles aren't really going to change too much, unfortunately. Most of the Enlightenment philosophers did not really think women had a big or needed a big place in society. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, for example, said that women should just be mothers and take care of the house. A few others, Diderot, Voltaire, etc., believe that women should have a bigger role in society, but none of them are going to be full-throated supporters of feminism. Two you should know include Mary Estelle. Mary Estelle, English writer, she wrote in the 16 and 1700s about women needing to be better educated. In her serious proposal to the ladies, she says that women need to be educated. Why are we just leaving half of Europe's population behind and not giving them a better shot at a better life? She also argues for marriage, for equality in marriage, that men and women should be seen the same and treated the same. At this point in Europe, in marriages, men always had the upper hand in terms of controlling property, controlling the activity of the wife, and forcing the wife around. Therefore, we see lots of examples of spousal abuse and violence and things like that. She said that women need to be seen as equal partners and not just as, as a trophy piece or someone to just take care of the kids. They should be an equal partner in affairs. Perhaps, though, the most famous writer of the Enlightenment on women's rights is Mary Wollstonecraft. She was active until the French Revolution. She was an English writer, but she did write a lot about the French Revolution, living through that in some sense. But she was a big opponent of Rousseau. When Rousseau wrote that women should just stay at home and have kids, Mary Wollstonecraft kind of took Mary Estelle's arguments and just expanded on them. She says that, if you're an Enlightenment writer and you think that the king's acting like a tyrant and dictator and you're arguing for the liberty of people, why does that liberty not apply to women? Why don't slaves get involved or included in your writing? Most of the Enlightenment philosophers ignored chattel slavery and the system of slavery that existed in the New World. Why are you, against the enslavement of the French people by the French king in your eyes, which, I wouldn't know if I would call that slavery, but that's what some of the Enlightenment philosophers said. Why are you against that tyrannical system, but for the oppression of women or the oppression of slaves? It doesn't make sense. She also said, if with this Enlightenment movement that all human beings are endowed with a spiritual voice of reason in their head, that they have this little part of their mind that allows them to think critically and challenge the world. Why are we why are we ignoring that women are also men? They're mankind, and why aren't they seen as having the same voice in their head? Why can't we imagine a spark of creativity, logic, and imagination in these women as well? Why is it only the men that get associated with this spark of brilliance? So she's saying we should also pay attention to women because they also have just as much mind and capability as men. She was unfortunately not really listened to too much, but however today she is kind of seen as the writer that kind of brings forward one of the first writers that brings forward the ideas of feminism, the idea that women deserve equal rights to men, which is a radical idea. Even today in some circles it's still a radical idea, but she is maybe one of the first feminists to kind of bring this forward and maybe gave birth to that ideology. Besides, being philosophers and writers and thinkers, women were also the main hostesses of salons. They hosted the salon gatherings, and they also gave money to philosophers. So they could be influential in ways besides writing and swaying public opinion, against monarchies and churches and things like that. All right. The last piece of the puzzle, before we do kind of some wrapping up, is the Jewish Enlightenment, or the Haskalah movement. This occurs during the Enlightenment and lasts later than the Enlightenment, you could argue, into the 1800s. But we're going to see European Jews such as Moses Mendelssohn. They're going to become more active and challenge some of the existing Jewish practices in Europe. Again, up until this point, Jews in Europe lived in close, tight-knit communities for the most part. They lived in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe. They're more present in Eastern Europe and what we would call Poland today, but also like Western Russia and places like that, in this area called the Pale of Settlement, which is where we see large numbers of Jewish people living in this period up until World War II. But we see Jewish people living in tight, close-knit communities to avoid pogroms and persecution. They were heavily dominated by the rabbis and by these elite religious groups that would kind of force Jews to live certain ways and act certain ways and follow certain religious laws, to kind of keep these communities, close-knit, but also protected from a intolerant, violent Europe that did not really treat Jews that well. However, with this Jewish Enlightenment, we start to see some things change slowly across the Jewish populations. We do see people like Moses Mendelssohn kind of advocate and call for Jews to kind of come out of seclusion, come out of these close-knit communities and enter into wide European society. Change your appearance, change the clothes that you wear, leave behind some of these ancient traditions and practices and become enmeshed and immersed in European society. They really did, advocate for wide-ranging acceptance into European society, not just kind of telling Jews, hey, join European society, but also kind of telling Europeans that they should accept Jewish people in the spirit of enlightenment and acceptance and liberty and equality. Why can't Jews also gain some of this acceptance? And we do really see this work in some instances. We do see from now until the late 1800s, across Europe, for the most part, Jews became more and more accepted. Tolerance increased. Jews are kind of welcomed into some certain areas in Europe, and they are tolerated at a greater level. throughout the next 100 years or so. We also see, and as a part of this movement, the revival of the Hebrew language, which had been extinct for centuries. But we see that kind of come back, and we see Jews again kind of still staying true to their Jewish values and ideas, but also, trying to blend in with the rest of society and assimilate in a sense. That'll get challenged later, but that's a next semester story. Last part, just some things to kind of sum up. Again, these aren't the only names that contributed to the Enlightenment. We see a wide range of people that are supportive of Enlightenment ideas, and challenge the church, the governments of Europe at this time. But we see lots of people that don't have famous names kind of make cartoons or make illustrations or add ideas to the Enlightenment. It's not just Montesquieu and Voltaire and Rousseau that did the work. It's lots of people that did the work. While this wasn't a overnight change, we see this happen over decades, but it is going to be a really influential century that we really do see things change. By the end of the 1700s, by the end of the century of Enlightenment, we do see several revolutions occur. We see the American, the French, and the Haitian revolutions occur, all inspired in some way by the Enlightenment. So it's not just, a movement that led to nothing. We do see wide-ranging movements caused by the Enlightenment. And lawyers, the bourgeoisie, they do play a big role in this movement as well. Some of them did lead the French Revolution, which we'll talk about, but a lot of them were lawyers, and you could not censor the writings of lawyers, especially if they were court briefings. Those could not be censored. So you could call for natural rights, or the right to revolt, or the general will. You could discuss that in your court filing, and you could not be censored. So lots of stuff going on, a really interesting time, and this is going to set the stage for the French Revolution in a few weeks. So we'll be there pretty soon. All right, that's it for the Enlightenment. Next time we'll look at the other parts of the 1700s and the Enlightened despots, and I'll catch you next time.